Hi there. Today I'd like to talk about what I've learned about studying birds using their habitat and how they can be used to inform revegetation, especially to build habitats for declining bird species within temperate woodlands. Now for me it all started back in my honours. I was given a couple of robin species to study, one of them being the hooded robin. Now in hindsight, being a novice, I was thrown in the deep end because they've got a nasty reputation of foraging in an area for a while, then taking off on you on a single long flight. Right, they're out of there. But the job was to follow these birds for long enough to get an idea where they repeat visit within their home range, a so-called hotspot. The idea then is to compare those hotspots with areas that just merely pass through, so-called cold spot. If you can work out the habitat differences between the two that underpins that variable use, that's what you need to keep in mind when you're building habitat that's going to suit this particular bird species. And here's an example. This is a home range use of a pair of hooded robins I followed for 3 days. Those lighter areas are those hotspots. The concentric circles are probability bands of variable use. The darker the colour, the less probability of use. Now I can tell you that within hotspots the birds spent longer time, they foraged for longer, and they caught more prey. And as far as habitat was concerned, hotspots had a more consistent cover of leaf litter. Leaf litter being the habitat for the invertebrate prey, that just makes good sense. But as I followed these birds around, I got the distinct impression they were foraging wherever they went. So it got me wondering, although this felt okay, is this pattern for real, or is it just a product of how I collected that data? Now really, to know for sure, you're going to need the bird's perspective on this. And this is it. Remember those long flights I told you about? This is them, between 50 and 180 metres. And straight away you can see they're associated with hotspots, as well as avoiding areas that they're not too keen on, and a couple around the home range boundary, there's them interacting with their hooded robin neighbours. They just don't like each other. But this tells you a couple of very important things. One is the birds will interpret and use their habitat within their home range at the patch scale. Another important question that's answered is if you get your observation distances right between not losing them but not interfering with them, you're actually going to behave quite normally, so you're not going to push the birds. So my next job was to inform the revegetation of the Para woodland located just outside of Gawler. The job here was to come up with a solution to build habitat for multiple declining species in the area. Now I'll tackle this from several angles, but one again was home range habitat use, but this time in the sweeter species. I'll just run through a couple now. So hooded robins. Here you use classification trees to tease apart the differences between hot and cold spots. There's a protocol how to read these trees, but I've just summarised down the bottom what they're saying. And again, hot spots had high litter cover in association with minimal mid-story cover. So nice open areas at the ground level with leaf litter. Not unlike this type of scene. There's a little male hooded robin foraging. Yellow thornbills. These guys forage within the foliage of the canopy of trees. And it's ironic that this guy's pictured in a calitris. Because in my sites, hotspots had about 20% calitris canopy cover in association with eucalypts, this time a pink gum. When I looked at all the foraging activity, the time spent in each tree species at each of my sites, it was dominated by foraging within calitris. You just take the top line, 93% of the time foraging calitris. On the far right is the time actually spent surveying those birds. So 93% of 11 and a half hours nearly. So quite significant amounts of time. Now considering that these calitris are co-dominant with other eucalypts, it shows a real preference towards this type of tree species. A couple of sites where they didn't forage as much in the calitris was in this site which had predominant of drooping she oak and this site with peppermint box. You look at these two tree species, they share something in common like the calitris. Their foliage is very tightly held together and the yellow thornbills forage on the inner portion of that foliage. So for them, not all tree species are the same. Woolly wagtail. Their hotspots had overstory between 20 and 50%. So not the really open areas, but not the really enclosed areas. So when you normally see a woolly wagtail, he's flicking around chasing invertebrates. But often that attack is staged from a static search. Static search from fixed substrates like branches and fallen timber, which the trees provide. And this is one of their hotspots, so a bit of an edge sort of environment, but they actually use these, they can hawk out, catch things, or go to the ground after they detect and spend some time flushing. Brown tree creeper. Their hotspots had hollows and lack of mid-story vegetation. So open areas They forage about half the time chasing ants, the other half the time they're up in the trees doing the same thing. But why hollows? A common theme in this talk is going to be that the ground foraging birds are very skittish and they're easily spooked and they look for refuge. These tree creepers use hollows for refuge. But why 3 or more than 3 per hotspot? There you have to understand how they roost. They roost in hollows, but when they do, they don't all pile down the same hole. They each use a different hollow, so they sleep alone. So it makes sense if they're looking for refuge, they'll each look for a different hollow when they're doing it. Yellow rump thornbill. Again, a ground foraging bird that is easily spooked and looks for low, dense vegetation, like this hotspot with the calitris. And what they do, they actually fly into the calitris, then drop down and fan out foraging. If they're spooked, they're quickly back into the calitris and then move on to the next tree. White-browed babbler. These guys like Acacia paradoxa or kangaroo thorn and calitris. Again, a ground foraging bird that needs that ready access to low, dense vegetation. But they also use this vegetation for roost nests here in thorn and calitris. So dense patches of this vegetation in combination with more open areas in which they forage. White-winged chough. These guys hate shrubs and they love litter. And that was very obvious at Parawura, where the shrub was quite dense and dominated by things like spiky guinea flower. So things they really wanted to avoid. But at Sandy Creek, this is a hotspot. So nice cover of litter, fallen timber, but in general, fairly open. This is one of their cold spots. So essentially the same sort of thing, save for the sedge. Now whether the sedge poked them as they walked around, but probably more so, from their low vantage point, laterally it would interfere with their vision. So it would make it very hard to pick up things like roaming fox. Plus they're a very sociable bird and they like to talk to each other, and it might be part of the fact they actually like to see each other as well. Rufous whistlers. There's a difference between the boys and the girls. The girls in red forage a lot lower, peaking around 1 metre, so they're in the shrubbery. Whereas the boys peak at 6 metres, so they're up in the canopy. In transition zones, about 3 metres. When I looked at the hotspots, it was dominated by mid-storey cover, which I measured between 1 and 4 metres, so right in the middle of that transition zone of the preferred foraging heights. So what they say this is trying to tell me is, like this hotspot, there was vegetation across a range of storey heights, from the shrubbery right up through to the canopy. So what have we learned so far? The birds use patches, and those patches have a measurable habitat characteristic that explains that use. Of course, different bird species have different habitat requirements, so they respond to different elements. But I don't think it's sufficient just to hand that information over to a revegetator, because then it's open to their personal interpretation as to what to do with it. My advice is to cheat like hell and simply copy what the birds are already doing. That home range of the hooded robins I showed you in the first slide, patches of areas that they're really hitting hard. Some areas, yeah, not so much. In other areas, again, they just simply avoided. But they weren't the only bird species out there. And of course, as you can see, they're probably all doing something a little bit different. So what I did, one part of my survey was, I was looking for high home range overlap between species to see how co-occurring species proportion a habitat area. And I achieved that with home range overlap averaging about 40 to 70% spatial overlap. But their hotspots did not. They separated out and generally lower than 10%, and often they were separate. Here's one of those sites. It's an open grassy woodland, which I surveyed birds in. Here's a couple of pairs of woolly wagtail, yellow rump thornbill, hooded robin, brown tree creepers, and white-browed babblers. As you see, they're all inhabiting the same habitat area, but targeting different parts of that habitat, which were explained by habitat variables. So my take-home message is, when you're building revegetation, do it as patches. Have one patch type that has the habitat characteristics of a predetermined bird species, being a desirable species such as a decliner, and have that layered throughout an area. Then have another patch type with a different habitat characteristic that suits another declining bird species, and layer that throughout an area as well. And so on and so forth, until you have, in the end, a montage of patches, with each patch type catering to the known habitat requirements of at least one bird species. So in the fullness of time, as that vegetation matures, you should encourage a bird community that contain bird species which are currently of conservation concern. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. We got plenty of time for questions, if there's any.
I just wonder whether you've assessed an area with an aquatic location in it too, and how that might mix up the birds.
Aquatic as in a water feature?
A waterhole, a creek or something like that.
Good question. Common theme here is a lot of surveys are done during the drought, which was also right in the middle of that. There was periods of rain where there was all this, probably able to see here, the site, take this all back, that white patch was actually an old sand mine, abandoned sand mine, which did fill with water during a rain event. There was attraction drawn to it, but it was an off event. But being an open, temperate woodland, there's not watercourses raging through it or anything like that. Yeah.
It might change the species a little bit.
Not the species, but the behaviour. Yeah, the babblers bathed in it and there was a drinking point. Yeah, so it became a source of, an open area that normally avoided was actually a source of attraction for a lot of birds. Yeah, but temporal.
Up the back, got a few.
Off you go.
So when you're talking about the wooded areas without mid-story and the needing to have a lot of leaf litter on the ground, so I guess in terms of how to restore that, what sort of tree density are you talking about? Because my experience is when we've made recommendations for low density plantings, it's very hard to shift from a grass-dominated ground cover to anything else, and those grasses dominate for a long time.
Yeah, so what was your question? I missed that with the mid-story component.
So you're saying, I guess, that when you construct, you're aiming for the mosaic of habitats, what's the sort of tree density that you're looking at when you talk about those open habitats with the litter cover on the ground?
The open habitats would be very sparse
Yep.
with the tree story, but in combination it'd be quite dense areas as well, especially with calitris that has a broadcast seeding and it tends to grow as groves. That happens naturally, and there's birds that do respond to that. So there's going to be a proportion of different densities throughout that. So with your low density plantings, it would have to be like edgy sort of environments, even contained within a habitat area, not a pure edge overlooking farmland. We actually create habitat edges within the body of a woodland. And with the mid-story, it just mix that up. You can see some habitat characteristics actually conflicting between what the birds are looking for, what they're avoiding. So just say trying to mix it up, and so you encourage different bird species that, because they'll go over and through and around areas they're not keen on to get to the areas they want. But conversely, that's being interpreted as low quality habitat for them. It's also being interpreted as high quality habitat by another occupying bird.
Yep.
On the left.
Oh, here we are. Yep.
Could you tell me whether the calitris-like in birds, there seem to be quite a few of them, does it matter to them whether there are other birds of different species in the same area at that time? Or does one species prefer one calitris patch to another? And what sort of number of trees have to be in a patch before they consider it appropriate? I mean, is one calitris enough, or do they have to have a reasonable number to go there?
Okay, it depends on how you use a calitris. If it's just a cover plant, like the yellow thornbills, yellow rump thornbills, they'll need open areas around that, so it has to be sparsely planted. Yet yellow thornbills, they'll just move quickly between trees, so the less distance between trees is probably the better. As long as the planting arrangement hasn't confounded the growth structure of that plant. When they get in the groves, they get very woody and sticky and a little bit of puff of foliage at the top, and that's just crap. Now, you want something a little bit further apart and get good looking trees that they can forage up and down the whole profile of that tree.
Will you get the same species in at the same time?
You certainly do, yes. Yeah, they're very amicable because they're doing different things. They're not directly competing.
Got time for one super quick one.
Thanks. What's your experience with woodland birds using olives? Because quite often we're dealing with trying to remove olives out of our grassy woodlands to restore it back to an open system, but the use of olive-infested woodlands.
The sites that are on were actually really good remnant vegetation that was heavily managed. So olives were eradicated. The few olives I did have had tree creepers foraging on them, mainly because of the bark structure. But I think of olives, yeah, the starlings would probably knock them around a lot. It comes to mind, the white-winged chough actually seek olives, and they'll eat the seed. They'll actually pare open the flesh to remove the seed, or they'll ground forage seeds that have decayed away, the flesh. They'll have that as part of their diet, but it's not principal, it's just opportunistic. Yeah, it is a food source, it is.
All right, that's all we've got time for. Thanks very much, Phil.
No problem.